Hi, everybody out there. Thank you for joining us today. Apologies, we're just sorting out a couple of technical difficulties. Welcome, in any case. My name is Adam, and I am the program manager at Latitude 53. I am, of course, here in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory, one neighborhood over from the gallery right now. This is the traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and Métis people. And our community and our place here exists only out of gratitude to those people who have always been here. I am about to be joined today, fingers crossed that everything works, by Mark Clintberg and Crystal Mowry. Mark's work is, of course, up in the gallery right now. Of course, it's quite difficult to visit the gallery right now because of the closures due to COVID, but we will be keeping Mark's work up until February 13th. So fingers crossed, in the new year, you will be able to come and visit the work. But in any case, Mark is going to be joined by Crystal Mowry, who is senior curator at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. And why don't I bring them on so that they can say hi. Hi.
Hi. Hi, everybody.
Where are the two of you joining us from today?
Mark, go ahead.
I am in Treaty 7 territory, also the home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3.
And I'm on the Haldimand Tract, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Ottawandaran, and the Haudenosaunee.
Cool. I will just leave the two of you to talk about the work and anything else you might like. Just FYI, if you're watching, we would love to take some questions a little bit later on. If you leave them in the comments on Facebook or YouTube where you're watching, we will be able to see them. But without further ado, let me get out of the way here.
Thanks so much, Adam. Thanks for your help setting this up, and of course for all of your assistance with the exhibition itself. Crystal, thank you for doing this. It is great to see you. It's so nice that working together in connection to this show has given us more excuses to talk to each other in the last few months.
I'm grateful for that, for sure.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
Should we preface what the plan is for today for our conversation for folks who are joining us? Because I didn't get a chance to see the show in person, but I have seen images of the show. And I think the way that we're likely to speak to and about and around the exhibition is definitely going to be it's going to be important, I think, and critical to see some images alongside our discussion. And I think it would be helpful for folks to have a little bit of insight on the exhibition before we get going. So would you be okay with that, Mark?
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds great. So why don't I say a little bit about the show? And I think that Adam has some images ready. And I'm a little bit less clear about how we see those images. That is Crystal and I. How we see them, but I imagine that our audience is seeing them, which is the important thing. And then after I give kind of a virtual verbal walkthrough of the show, just a short one, then Crystal and I are going to have a dialogue, and of course we're really receptive to having questions from the group. Yeah. So Adam, could we start with the image of the newspaper photograph, please? Great, thanks. Terrific. So this exhibition, in some ways, it starts in 1979, but in other ways, it starts in the late 1980s and kind of early 1990s. This is a news story, a newspaper article that's a reproduction based on a 1979 news article. And I came across this article because of some work that I was invited to do with the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. And the CIH at the University of Calgary has been doing a series of different maps connected to Treaty 7 territory. And they've commissioned different researchers and writers to basically collect data, collect research, and write historic accounts. And then they've commissioned artists to create imagery and visualizations about those events and basically make a map, a series of maps. And so I was invited to do the visual work for a map based on the research of Kevin Allen in this book, Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary. And this is a really incredible book. If you haven't heard of it before, I strongly recommend it. Kevin actually happens to live just down the street from me. And he does a series of different walking tours of different parts of the city that are connected to oral history research that he's done. And he has this one section of the book where he talks about this episode in 1979. And I'm not going to read it out, but I'll just quickly summarize it. So what happened was that on September 22nd, 1979, there were a group of men who were cruising for sex and encounter at the Central Memorial Park, which is downtown in Calgary. And at around 10 p.m., there was an altercation between this group of homophobic men that showed up on the scene and a group of men that were cruising. And two of the men that were cruising for sex decided to respond violently. And they attacked one of the men who was making these homophobic and threatening remarks. They chased him into an alley and they murdered him. And they killed him with a broken beer bottle. And so his name is Thomas Nash. So he was 22 years old at this time. And the two men who were cruising that attacked this man were Brian Christopher Hawkhurst and Greg Paul Spencer. And they were 20 and 19 respectively. And this story, I read this news item and I read Kevin's book working on this CIH project. And this story especially resonated with me for a number of reasons. I mean, I think that the story is an inversion of the usual stories that we're used to hearing about connected to sex in public space and the consequences of sex in public space and who dies because of sex in public space, who's at risk, who is violent, who's the perpetrator of that violence, and so on. And then also, the fact that this event happened when I was a little less than 1 year old. I'm revealing my age. It really struck me as an episode that has occurred within my lifetime and, is the result of deep-seated homophobia, but also, policies, governmental policies that have put non-normative people at risk and continue to. So it really stood out for me. And the second kind of part of this is that, in the late 80s and early 90s, I was a kid who was really reading the newspaper a lot. We had a subscription to the Edmonton Journal. I read it almost every day, always the first section, every news story, while I was having breakfast before going to school. And I was just so accustomed to reading stories about gay and lesbian people and other non-conforming people, trans people, queer people, two-spirited people being the victims of violent crimes and losing their jobs because of their sexuality. I remember there was one story about a teacher who was fired from a school, I think it was a secondary school in Edmonton because of his sexuality. And he'd been hiding this and hiding the fact that he had a same-sex partner at home. And when it was discovered, he was fired. And so I was just so used to reading these really distressing stories. And at the time, I mean, I wasn't out. I didn't really understand my sexuality in its full complexity. I mean, I think I still don't understand my sexuality in its full complexity. That's what's so amazing about sexuality and gender. I think they're always on the move. Anyhow, as someone who was used to seeing news stories like this, then encountering this story again in my 40s, working on this mapping project, it really resonated. And I thought, I want to make an artwork about this. And you can see that in that news story, there's an image of a silver jacket. And this is a jacket that one of the attackers left at the scene after the murder occurred. And incidentally, the two attackers, they fled to Penticton in a stolen vehicle, and they were arrested a couple of days later. So this jacket is kind of like, it's an aide-memoire, it's a piece of evidence. I think there's also a lot of symbolic value that's embedded in it. And this photo of the jacket was so evocative to me that I decided, okay, as part of my artistic strategy, I want to make a replica of this jacket. So what I did was I worked with Jolie Bird, who's an artist that is also based in Treaty 7 and who also teaches at the Alberta University of the Arts, which is where I teach. She is a technician there. So I worked with Jolie to select and then sort of redevelop a sewing pattern to try and make a replica of this bomber jacket. And then we made it in 3 different sizes. So there are 3 jackets that are displayed at the very beginning of the exhibition when you walk in, and they are in 3 different sizes. So Jolie and I worked to make the sizing approximately the same as like something that would fit a 6-year-old, a 19-year-old, and then a 42-year-old. So the 42-year-old jacket is made to fit me. The 19-year-old jacket is made to fit one of the 2 men who fled the scene. And then the smallest jacket is really to imagine, I guess both these men that were convicted and the man who was attacked and me at different moments in our history. Because, I think it's a really useful strategy, and it's a strategy that's often talked about in Buddhist philosophy that, when someone is really frustrating you, or you're afraid of them, or you're upset with them, it's useful to imagine them as a child or as an infant, and also, in their 90s as a senior citizen, as well as in the age moment that you're meeting them. And yeah, I thought that this was like a useful technique to imagine these people in different moments, and yeah, to create this kind of surrogate object that really, it has the look of something that might be used in a theatrical performance. And each of them has a little tag in it that says JB, which is for Jolie Bird. And the other one has this sort of like invented name for myself, Mark August Clintberg, with a K. And there are kind of like family history reasons connected to that I won't go into. But basically, my family name is misspelled based on my Swedish ancestry. And I thought, like Mark August Clintberg sounds like that could be a playwright, or maybe like a fashion designer, or a dramaturge, or somebody that might be involved in making this theatrical performance that's connected to this historic episode. So then, I was looking at the pattern pieces that we had cut, and that Jolie had used to make the jackets. And they really fascinated me as these kind of like 2-dimensional forms that also had a lot of sculptural possibilities. And like so many of us, I was trying to find ways to make work on my dining room table, because I do have a studio space, but because of the pandemic, I really have not been spending time in it, just for safety reasons. For myself, it doesn't feel like a safe environment. So I made this show in my home on my dining room table. And my dining room table is a little bit more than 48 by 24 inches. And I found a sheet of paper that's made in that dimension, laid out the pattern pieces on that sheet of paper, and then basically made stencils using this liquid ink to make a kind of impression, almost like a chalk outline of each of these pattern pieces. So there are 5 of these works of on paper in the show that show the silhouettes of these different components that make up the 3 jackets in the show. And then I started to kind of think more about my research process and my relationship to the archive. And I have a parallel practice as an art historian. And in my scholarly work, one of the things that I have thought about more and more is the way that archives are both opportunity, but also, opportunity for studying history, but also an opportunity for fabulation. And, while I was working on this show, I realized, like, yes, I'm starting with the archive, but the more and more that I work on this history, the more and more distortions are coming out. And so that kind of connects to the other side of the gallery, where there are a series of works on paper that are cut silhouette. They're cut out of Strathmore paper, which is kind of like almost like a Bristol board. And each of those works, again, is cutouts of different components of the pattern pieces that were used to make the jacket. But here, the idea was that I wanted to cut out these pieces of Strathmore paper and then use those pieces for another purpose, which I'll describe in a moment. So as I was cutting out these pieces, I really started to think that this really is an analogy for what sort of happens in the research process. Is that, you start with this archival photo, a news story, other material that you find in the archive. Then it is translated into another form. In my case, that's a 3-dimensional jacket. And then that offers more opportunities for other translation and transformation into these works on paper. And once it turns into this black silhouette, the contours of that history have become that much more rigid and solid and, stark, I guess. So the reason I wanted to cut out all of these silhouettes is because while I was looking at the pattern pieces, I was thinking a lot about Edmonton and a lot about many of the forms of public art and sculpture that we see in that region. And, Anthony Caro has been a major influence on the way that large-scale sculpture has happened through the University of Alberta, but also, beyond that institution. And, Caro is an artist who worked on a massive scale with steel and I believe other forms of metal too, not exclusively steel. And so I was looking at works by Caro. I mean, he's somebody that I do think about from time to time because there's such a presence of Caro's legacy here in Alberta. And I found this one suite of works that's called Night Movements. And as I was looking at this suite of works, I noticed that the individual components that go into making up Caro's work, the contours really looked like the pattern pieces that I was working with to make these jackets. And so I wanted to cut out all this Strathmore paper because I wanted to make these sort of paper maquettes of Anthony Caro-like sculptures. And so there are 3 of these photographs in the show, and they're titled after Anthony Caro's Night Movements work. And they are basically proposals for monument or memorial associated with this one very specific historic event from September of 1979. And I mean, you can see that, like, from these photographs, I mean, I'm working with adhesive tape and staples and, this relatively cheap paper and a cardboard box that showed up in the mail, all to make this maquette that then might be sent in as an application for, the process of applying for a public artwork. And I just thought, as I was making these, I was thinking a lot about, the different forms of memorialization and monument that we have in our province and the difference between sanctioned and unsanctioned or vernacular monuments and city or municipally sponsored or provincially sponsored monuments. And, I just thought, like, based on the UCP context that we're living in right now, like, maybe this humiliated, if I can be candid, shitty monument that's made out of junky paper that is just going to, like, wash away is something that our current provincial government would actually agree to in terms of monumentalizing or memorializing an episode connected to non-normative people in this province. So that is a really quick walkthrough. There is one work that I haven't talked about yet that I want to bring up later on once we're in discussion. So that's basically, oh wait, no, there are 2 works, sorry, that I haven't talked about yet, but I do want to talk about those 2 once we're kind of in dialogue. So that's a really cursory introduction to the show that actually did still take something like 20 minutes. So thanks for sticking with me, folks.
That was great, Mark. Thank you so much for that. And you and I, for folks out there who don't know, like Mark and I have had a chance to talk about this work a couple of times in advance of the exhibition actually materializing. So I have to remember that not everyone's going to know what we've talked about before. So if I revisit some of that territory, Mark, you understand why. So, you know, you and I have talked on different occasions about the archive and some of the oversights that are almost inherent to the archives as a kind of project. And one thing that I think about from time to time, and have been thinking about more lately as I work with artists who are spending a lot of time in archives, is how for folks who are racialized or who don't identify as heteronormative, or who have difficulty in general seeing themselves reflected in accurately in the media. I think about how finding yourself in the archive can sometimes require one to take up traumatic language. So, you know, thinking about search terms and how you find evidence of a history that that you would see yourself belonging to, and so that can be a kind of a difficult realization when you're within those spaces, those kind of institutional structures. So, you know, and you had mentioned that, you know, you were thinking about archives as a place where there's an opportunity for learning, but on the other hand, there's an opportunity for fabulation. And while I totally agree with the notion of the promise that's inherent in an archive as it being a place where you can learn, I also think about the role that that confirmation plays in an archive. So, you know, wanting to find evidence of yourself, in a sense, in the archive, which is maybe in a way a kind of a strategy to dispel fabulation or to keep kind of fabulation in check. So I'd love to know how you move through this space. You know, it can be the physical space of the archive, but also the psychological space of the archive, and what kind of experiences in those spaces you carry into the studio.
Wow, great questions, Crystal. There's so much richness there. I mean, I love visiting the archive. I have to say that I get a lot of pleasure from the experience. That said, I mean, I do think that archives can be extremely exclusionary spaces, and all archives are different in their approaches and, you know, their mandates and how they interact with their publics. But you know, I think that archives at their best are places for seeking connection, I guess. And yeah, I mean, I think the notion of the touch across time is something that many of us are looking for in the archive. We're looking for the touch of our ancestors. We're looking for the touch of our beloveds. We're looking for you know, some way of understanding ourselves too. And I think that, you know, for me, growing up as a queer cis white settler on the prairies, you know, my first archival experiences were actually, I wasn't really thinking about looking for someone like me. I was actually just at first trying to understand what is an archive? Like, what am I supposed to do here? You know, I'm only allowed to use a pencil. Like, you know, kind of figuring out, so much of it at first was just figuring out the rules of the game, I guess.
Yeah, the protocols, right?
Yeah, the protocols. And, you know, again, I think that archives at their best, actually the protocols, they're not just about protecting the documents, they're also about respecting the visitor and the ancestors that are connected to these objects. You know, the people that have come before us that are connected to the objects that we're consulting. Many of them are living objects, you know, they are alive, and those objects too deserve respect. So, you know, after figuring out some of the stuff about protocols and kind of my motivations for being in the archive, I have more and more realized that I go to the archive when I'm lonely. I go to the archive when I'm hurting. And I mean, I feel a little bit vulnerable talking about this, not just because this is in public, but perhaps because some of my students are here today. I can't see all of the participants that are here, but and the reason I feel a little bit sensitive talking about it is because I've just done a class on site-specific practice with a group of students at the Alberta University of the Arts, and we did archival work, even though it was virtual. And I know that, yeah, for them, I really think that some of them had similar experiences of going to the archive feeling lonely and feeling hurt, and that we're not just seeking connection. I think that sometimes we go to the archive when we're seeking healing, and it can be devastating when we don't find it. Then we're kind of left on the trail again. We didn't find the healing that we hoped to, and so we're kind of on search again. We're looking more. But nonetheless, I think that even when we leave the archive still feeling lonely, something special does happen just through seeking. I'm somebody who, both in terms of like my sexuality and gender, and also in terms of my spirituality, in terms of my scholarly work, I know it's kind of a 1970s thing to say, but I really do identify as a seeker. I'm curious, and I'm looking, I'm not always sure what I'm looking for, but I'm somebody who seeks. So, I mean, those are a few of the things that I think about when I think about archives. I mean, I also think about the way that archives can be risky places too, because sometimes we find things that maybe we shouldn't have. We find out information that is highly sensitive. We get in contact with an object or a person or a legacy that is more than we can handle. And, that's another way that trauma can occur, actually, I think, in the archive. It's not just about not getting access. Not getting access is traumatic. Not seeing yourself reflected in the archive is traumatic. But then sometimes what you do find and the connection that you do come across, that you intersect with, is more traumatic than you could have imagined. And yeah, I mean, in thinking about this particular history from 1979, I'm not sure that I can say that I achieved any sort of state of healing. I came to a greater understanding, I suppose, about my own embedded, internalized homophobia. I'm not going to dress it up. I mean, that is part of the research outcome for me from this project. It's. I know I'm going on and on here, but I'm reaching a denouement.
It's okay.
But yeah, I mean, it does make me think about how I've talked about this research project as it's been in development, and talked about the exhibition as it's been in development. And anytime that I say, oh, I'm doing a project that has something to do with public sex, I think that people either they get really excited, or they get really anxious, or they sort of feel the contours of their own politics around what public sex is, or what it might be for them or for somebody else. And I mean, of course, the question that is going to come to mind when I say this is like, oh, is Mark looking for public sex? Is that one of his research strategies? Like, these are things that, of course, people are wondering.
Methodologies, yes.
Yeah, what are your methodologies is always the question here. And I mean, it does make me think about the fact that, in introducing some of this research to my family, I mean, I've been fairly circuitous about talking through this body of work, because there's actually a second part, and maybe, I don't know, third, fourth part connected to this work. There's a second part that I am planning on completing in Paris at La Cité as part of an artist residency that was meant to happen this year, but of course is rescheduled. That is about the men's toilets at Gare de l'Est in Paris, which are, publicly acknowledged, have been publicly understood as a place that men go to cruise for sex since at least the 1970s, if not before. And if any of you are curious about seeing this place and you're not in Paris and can't go there physically, it's also very well documented in the film En Blessé. A lot of that film takes place in and was filmed in those toilets. And anyway, so the research project is basically about this toilet environment and its architecture. And I want to make a period room, like a museological period room that replicates this toilet, which has since been renovated and no longer exists in the state that it did before. And the reason that it was renovated was to allow for police enforcement to prevent any sexual activity from taking place at this site. Anyway, the point of me setting all of this up is that a few months ago, well, actually it was earlier in the year, before the pandemic, my partner and I were visiting my family, and my mother asked me, like, so what's this project that you're going to do in Paris? What's it all about? And I just said, it's about a part of a building that was demolished. It's an architectural research project. And my partner looked at me like, what are you doing? So I guess what I mean is that when I say that this research is, I mean, it really is revealing for me at its deepest level forms of internalized homophobia that I thought that I had long since dealt with. Growing up as a fragile, emerging baby queer in Calgary in the late 90s, my sense of self was just could be so easily shattered, and I lived being afraid of being seen. And I don't feel that way anymore, but there are still these layers, there, even in my scholarly identity, there are still layers of that are part of what shaped me in my adolescence. And although it's confusing, I think the archive is a kind of acoustic environment in which to enter and sound out those layers and feel them.
Mm-hmm. When you were at the early part of the event, when you were going through your images and you were talking about your relationship with the newspaper, it made me think of how, for many of us, our first kind of understandings of how archives are built are through seeing newspaper clippings. So I remember as a child, if something was relevant, it would get clipped from the newspaper, and it might get squirreled away and added to some kind of like memory book or album, especially if the event had some kind of familial connection. But the clippings were the kind of sign of relevance, and that kind of movement of cutting from the newspaper excising was a gesture of posterity. And when I look at those prints that you made, or I don't even know, can we call them prints? The stencils, I don't even have a language really to describe them. They're drawings, but they're prints, but they're something else, right? They remind me of seeing a hypothetical newspaper wherein, everything that happened was worthy of clipping. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and just what that might mean, to create a document wherein every fragment, every part of it is equally as important as the next, thus warranting, this action of clipping it all. It also makes me think of being, a grad student, or even like anyone being a student, wherein you read a text that is so incisive and so affecting that you end up highlighting the whole thing, right? Because you want to remember it all, because it's all so important. So I wonder, in terms of a kind of material relationship that you would have had with the newspaper as a child, do you find that the way that the design of that kind of document, that kind of a document of the present, the design, or even just kind of noting choices in the way that stories would be framed, if any of that has had a bearing on how you communicate history?
Wow. Another great question. Well, yeah, I mean, it does bring to mind the idea of this infinite archive, right? Like, mm-hmm. What if every news item, every clipping was archived somewhere? And I mean, I think that it has been a false promise to say, oh, well, the internet does that, because evidently it does not. It's quite clear that it does not do that. Maybe for the benefit of all of us, it does not do that, and it doesn't need to do that, I would say. Yeah, so that image of the grad student or the undergraduate student who finds the scholarly article or the artist writing or whatever that is just so rich, they want it all. They want to, they reread it. It becomes like almost a fetish, like a sort of a written fetish. And I think that can happen with newspapers too. For me, the Edmonton Journal was, I mean, we didn't have a subscription to, I don't know, the New York Times, or like the printed matter that was coming into my house was Popular Science, Martha Stewart Living, Canadian House and Home, I think, or some variation. Maybe it's changed titles, but basically that magazine. My sister's copies of Sassy.
Sassy.
Yeah.
Sassy.
I think there was one that was called 16 or 17 or something like that.
I think it was 17. Yeah.
Did I say Popular Science already? Yeah, and then there's the Journal. And I mean, I didn't have subscriptions to anything. I don't know. I never thought about it, because I just thought, like, this is my archive. I guess, I didn't call it an archive then, but I really thought, like, oh yeah, this is my material. This is what I'm going to read over. Anyhow, getting back to the Journal itself, I really grieve the recession and erosion of local media and local news media. I think it's a tragedy that none of us have fully realized the implications of yet, but we're beginning to see them. I think it's a form of fracturing of experience where, I mean, yeah, if you don't see yourself in news media and you don't find out about things that are relevant to your locale because of that news media, that's obviously going to be a really huge gap. Anyhow, the design, I think, was the question that you kind of concluded with there. And yeah, I'm sure that there are people who read the Edmonton Journal, and there might even be a couple of people that write for the Edmonton Journal or work for the paper in the call. And, probably many people in the region around Latitude 53 remember Ed. Ed was a supplement, kind of like Saturday Night for the Edmonton Journal. And although it showed up later, I mean, basically I was an adult by the time that Ed came around. Ed was really a special part of the Journal. And I'm so sad that, as far as I know, it no longer exists. I mean, Adam, you can put something in the chat if I'm wrong about that. Anyhow, so Ed was this, yeah, Adam says definitely not, LOL. Okay, so Ed was basically like an arts and culture, music, like fashion kind of supplement for the paper. And I was so excited when I first started seeing it that I thought, I'm going to write for this thing. Like, I want to contribute to this. And I'm really lucky that I was able to write for Ed for a few years when I was living in my parents' basement trying to save up money for grad school. I was living in Spruce Grove and just thought, like, okay, this is a way that I'm going to try and like make a go of it living in this region again. And yeah, I mean, the design of it was really, I thought, beautiful, actually. And, it was very pictorially driven, great photography. And, next to Ed, the Edmonton Journal just looked really stodgy, actually. But I didn't realize that until after I'd seen kind of an alternative, a local alternative to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I mean, I know that a textile cutting table also looks the same as this, right? And I can remember, laying out fabric and then also laying out your pieces and experiencing that desire for everything fitting in its place, everything having sufficient room. And then also thinking about, if you are if you are working in fabric and you are working with pattern and print, the location of each one of those pieces is going to be of utmost importance. And one thing that folks may not know, if you haven't had a chance to see the show or to be engaged with its constituent parts intimately, is like a detail about the coats. Another detail about the coats, which, as you know, Mark, is one of my favorite details about the coats, which is the pockets. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the materiality of the pockets, because the actual fabric used for that part of the sculpture garment is different than the silver sateen. So.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So the jackets themselves are made out of bridal satin in this silver color. And then there's one orange lining, one sort of teal lining, and one pink lining. And so the lining was kind of an opportunity for me and for Jolie, I would say too, to play a bit and to embellish, right? Because the photograph from the newspaper doesn't show what the interior of the jacket is, but it does show that there are pockets. And I thought, pockets are interesting places. Pockets are kind of like purses and bags to me. I love playing this game with my nephew that's called What's in Mark's Bag, where I just hold up my bag and I say, what do you think's in here? Do you want to guess? And then they all they both make their guesses, and then I dump it out, and it's like, okay, yeah, there's like my lip balm and so on and so forth. So the pocket is a place where you hide things, but also it's a practical place. It's a place of security, I guess, on garments. And so I thought, okay, well, if the pocket is out of view, I mean, I want to do something interesting with the pockets. And Jolie and I were at a fabric store, and somehow in the remnants bin, there was all of this Missoni knit that was 70% off. And although it's not actually from 1979, it really had the look of Missoni from the late 70s or early 80s. And I just thought, like, for me, as a little gay boy growing up just outside Edmonton, I didn't even know what Missoni was, but it aligns with something of my notion at the time about what it means to be like a fancy, luxurious person, regardless of sexuality or gender. And, there's something of like glamour about that material that, especially once it is touched, it's really like, it just has such an incredible texture about it. And the coloration is so beautiful. It's like a fireworks display. So I thought, this is a way of me kind of inserting, I guess, like a message from myself at the age of 42 back to myself as an adolescent, like at the age of 19 or 20. I guess that's not really adolescence, but late adolescence, early adulthood, the age at which these attackers were in 1979. And also a message back to myself as a 6-year-old, just like as if this fabric is like a connecting conduit that creates some kind of continuum of rather simple luxury. I mean, I think the material cost us, it was like maybe each pocket has like $3 of Missoni in it, but it's still Missoni. It's $3 of Missoni, Crystal. And
I know, I appreciate it.
I also don't mind saying too that, like, something that comes up a lot, I find, in my teaching, because I talk about collections and I talk about like how artists work with collections and have collections. Students will often ask me like, oh, do you have any collections? And I don't really collect much of anything except clothing. And a few, like maybe 10 years ago, a lot of my friends were like, oh, I love to collect china, or I love to collect records or whatever. And I just thought, I want to collect couture and like great clothes. And I don't need to own a lot of them, but I would like to own some really beautiful things and then, be able to kind of bring them to life. And I buy them secondhand, which is a caveat. And a few years ago, I actually found this like secondhand Missoni sweater that is another kind of origin point for those pockets, because it brought something up for me about my notion of, yeah, kind of what it means to be a queer person too. And like ideas about, oh, well, is being like a plugged in, relevant queer, does that mean like that you travel to Italy every summer and like go to Lake Como and you convene with your fellow gays? Like what does it mean? And I think that really as a teenager, I did imagine that something like that was, this is what gay people do. Like they travel the world, they're rich, they found a way to get out of Edmonton, is kind of what I thought about what it meant to survive as a queer person. Is like it meant leaving Alberta. And of course, like as I matured, I realized that you can survive and even thrive in this region. You don't have to go to Lake Como to survive as a gay person.
I hope not. I mean, I think it's worthwhile to stick with the idea of survival and how it relates to visibility and invisibility, especially with the jackets as a bit of an analogy for that, because the silvery fabric that's used for the jackets isn't like a holographic material, right? And I think silvery material under certain light can almost can be hyper visible, but to the point where it almost like obliterates or halos what's around it, right? So it's like a defensive visibility. Whereas, I think a kind of gray or silver without any without illumination can kind of disappear into a built environment. So we think about like silver as looking a lot like gray against concrete. And thinking about visibility and invisibility of queer bodies in built environments, and thinking about the park, the memorial park where the murder occurred, that has been so influential for this project. I wonder if there are characteristics about that space, the memorial park space, that have kind of found ways to creep into your project at all, or if it's merely a setting for an event, which is really the focus of your interest.
Wow, I love that commentary and that question. Yeah, I mean, I too see the connection between silver and gray. Silver, potentially highly visible if it's reflective, like a coin, but also potentially a form of camouflage. I mean, I deliberately wore a silvery gray garment. I don't think its silveriness really shows up on the screen, which is too bad, but I think it kind of demonstrates your point, Crystal, actually, that, something that seems gray can actually be, this kind of like out of this world, almost hallucinogenic, metallic kind of texture, but you have to see it in the right light. And, I have really wrestled with the question of visibility a lot in the last couple of years. I would really actually, it's really in the last year that I've really wrestled with it. And it's in part because of a class that I recently started teaching that's called Queer Methodologies, which I taught for the first time last year. And I am in a debt of gratitude to all of the students who were in that cohort, because in that class, one of the questions that came up was about visibility and safety, I guess. Like what does it mean to create a safe space? What does it mean to be visible, for histories to be visible? And more than one person in that group pointed out that visibility does not equal safety, and that it is a very different thing to be visible depending on who you are. And, if you are a racialized person, if you are someone who's not cis, if you're gender nonconforming, like to be visible is not a guarantee of safety. And so, yeah, I mean, in bringing this history to light, well, I'm not the first person to bring this history to light through the exhibition, but in drawing further attention to it, I mean, I have wondered about what kind of risks are possible in reminding people who may have forgotten about this history, or possibly spreading spreading the story of what happened. Because, you know, this particular episode in history, I do wonder about how favorable a view it promotes about men who have sex with men. You know, I mean, basically the story is men were looking to have sex with other men in a park, and they murdered somebody. You know, like, this is, I don't know if that's really, like, if that gives a sense of positive reinforcement about those identities. But of course, part of what that very simple read doesn't really take into account is that, you know, that those people were aggressed, that these two men were aggressed by someone who was threatening them.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, using public space can be a very enjoyable, fun thing if it is safe. But if it is unsafe and someone chooses to use that space anyway, looking for sex, looking for encounter, or just, you know, trying to have some solitude, then obviously that is a very different thing. So that's actually a nice segue into another one of the works in the show that I wanted to save to talk about, which is this quilt. And it's a quilt that I made with a group of women on Fogo Island that I've worked with in the past. It's Lillian Dwyer, Millicent Dwyer, and Violet Cumden are the artists who helped me with making this. And we created a project together, as well as with a total of 15 other women on Fogo Island when I was doing an artist residency there in 2014. It's called Passion Over Reason. So this work it's sort of like a reprise or a return to some of the ideas in that first quilted work that I made with the women on Fogo Island. And that first quilt, Passion Over Reason, was based on a quote from Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And then the second quilt is also based on a quote from Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So we recently had the anniversary of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's statement that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. And, you know, when he said this at the end of the 1960s, it was a bit of a meteorite, you know, in terms of a political understanding about how sexuality exists within a nation state and how it could be or maybe should not be policed. And yeah, I mean, I think it has been since then largely celebrated as a highly progressive view about the relationship between citizens, their sexuality, and the state. But one of the things that statement really overlooks is that sexuality doesn't only exist in the bedroom. And sexuality, first of all, is not only about sex. It's not only about erotics. Sexuality is much more complex than that, and much more complex than I could describe or even understand myself. But I do know that it's not only about sex, and it's not only about seeking erotic connection. So if sexuality doesn't only exist in bedrooms, that means that we bring it to every space. Every single space that we go to, you know, sexuality exists in. It's not just about a sexual activity that defines sexuality. So thinking about Pierre Elliott Trudeau's statement, I thought, well, if there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I feel like that's inadequate, then what about if I reformulate this equation? And I was really thinking about Rosalind Krauss, actually, of all people, and this one text that she wrote called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, which some of you may know. It has something that's called a Klein diagram in it, where she tries to redefine how sculpture has been categorized in the 1970s. And basically, she comes up with these other categories by creating this diagram that kind of stretches out from sculpture. And I wanted to do something like that with Trudeau's statement. And so I just said, you know, my statement is no bedrooms, no state, no nation, and no place. You know, what would happen to sexuality if we didn't think about them being confined to the bedroom, confined to the state? Like, the idea of a sexuality that is confined to the state or to the nation is just so grotesque to me. And what about, too, thinking about no place, which is one of the ways that we can think about defining the term utopia. You know, what would happen to sexuality if we thought about it existing in no place? And of course, there I'm influenced by Jose Esteban Munoz's book, Cruising Utopia. So this kind of collection of text, it just seemed appropriate to put it onto a quilt, an object that goes onto a bed, which, also, again, does not need to be confined to a bedroom. So that is a very kind of circuitous way, again, of answering your question about visibility, because although this, Trudeau's statement is at the end of the 1960s, I actually forget if it's 68 or 69, someone is going to correct me on that. And then this murder happens in 1979, Trudeau's statement is still in the air today, in sexuality studies. Either people are, in favor of it, they're against it, they want to modify it, whatever. And it certainly would have been in 1979 too, even though I was only 1 year old. I'm sure that, this is a statement that still had relevance then, but I think had probably become somewhat shop worn. And now I think is even more shop worn as a term. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make it into this quilt that actually looks like it's quite old, even though it's newly fabricated. And in the images that Adam put up, you can see that it's sort of been like tossed across this tabletop as if it's just like someone's been very, very quickly making a bed to kind of like make the bedroom presentable again, which is the effect that I was hoping for. Or as if it's in my studio actually, and I'm just like quickly laying it out just to have it stretched out. Because these tables that I asked Latitude to install are really the kind of work table that I was accustomed to seeing in the family garage when we were working on a project together. And it seemed like I wanted to bring that back into the space.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking as you were talking about or relaying Trudeau's statement, if Trudeau's statement or position is essentially that the private excursions and pleasures of the nation are essentially private, or that the state has no place in governing or regulating pleasure in a sense. I think about how the state has created public situations wherein there's a hyper-surveillance. So, we can think about cities like London where there's just surveillance to the hilt, right? There's nothing that can happen in that city without the state knowing. Those kinds of interventions, those kind of civic interventions, and prohibit or discourage pleasure in public space, right? There's essentially this way that through kind of back channel civic design that pleasure can be prohibited from those spaces, or from public spaces, parks and cemeteries and the like. I also think about how Lana Wachowski's speech has been so influential to you. And for those of you who are not familiar with the speech, it's a speech from 2012. It was given at the Human Rights Campaign Awards for the Visibility Award, right? And I remember when this speech was first published online, or after the event, there was a lot of attention paid not just to Lana in being visible in a manner that it was not predicated on what her artistic work was, right? It wasn't an award given to her for her work on The Matrix or on other creative projects. It was for, who she was as an individual and the kind of politics that were relevant and important to her. And I know that speech in particular has had an influence on work that's been made for this exhibition. And I think primarily the portal, the ornate portal between two of the gallery spaces, right? Yep, there we go. Which is, I think when we first talked about that work, Mark, I imagined a kind of confessional screen, but it's something so much more, so much warmer in a way, and less about shame to me. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that work and some of the thoughts that underline its manifestation.
Yeah, gladly. So I first encountered that speech by Lana Wachowski through a song by Burial that's called Come Down to Us. And if you haven't heard it before, I really recommend listening to it. It's a very powerful piece of music. And at the very end of the song, which I think is something like 13 minutes, there's an excerpt from Lana Wachowski's acceptance speech. And in that speech, she describes imagining other worlds and other rooms, other worlds that were previously unimaginable. And, you know, in part because of the speech, but also the power of its placement in this piece of music, this, like, it really brought me to tears the first time that I heard it. Actually, I heard it because of Benny Nemirovsky-Ramsey, who's one of my frequent collaborators. And I was staying with him on a trip in Berlin at the time, and the song is so long, right? And he just kept saying, "It's not over yet," because I was getting really very emotional, and he just kept saying, "It's not over yet. This is not, it's not over." Anyway, this idea, I think, is just so extraordinary. I mean, it's very simple, but it really is extraordinary to imagine that. Also that in gender and sexuality, in our identities, that there's a possibility of thinking of other rooms, other worlds that we could not imagine before. And that, these forms of expression are either latent or enacted, like they're either waiting to be brought to life, or they are things that are living, that we bring to life. And I just think it's so amazing to think about that speech in connection to the universe of The Matrix, which I'm so glad that Latitude was able to do a screening of The Matrix last week, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't participate in it. But because the Matrix, the first Matrix, I think actually does really hold up as an important film. The other ones, I mean, are very mixed, I think, but the first one, I think, is still a pretty incredible film just on its own. But also, I think that it's an incredible metaphor or it's a tool that we can use to think through some components of gender and sexuality. And, that basically the matrix is heteronormativity. And that once we can see beyond the limitations, like really the criminal, well, not criminal, but the repressive limitations of heteronormativity, that there's this whole other world of consciousness that is possible, and that it's a form of consciousness or a form of being that always has the possibility of expanding, almost like a building that you keep finding that behind that wall there's another form of desire, or in that next room is something that you never could have dreamed a week before, no matter what your age is, no matter where you're at in terms of your gender and sexuality. And like, wow, that actually just makes life so much more interesting for me personally. Like, to think about those possibilities for myself and for others, it's like, this is what I think that this is what connection is all about, is like always trying to think through possibility together and in solitude. So the quote obviously really resonated with me, but it also made me think about another use of the term other rooms, which is actually in a volume by Truman Capote, which is something that I read, in my early 20s, like really trying to understand myself and my sexuality, like wondering, am I a Truman Capote kind of gay, or am I some other kind of gay? I don't know. And like, I really got into Capote as a writer, but also as a person, because, his life story is fascinating. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically he suffered a major, he had a major opportunity as a writer, and then it was a total disaster. And he had to like go back to his family. And I went through an experience like that too, where I was offered a major opportunity. It did not work out. And I had to come back to Alberta and actually move back in with my parents. And it was really devastating. But I found this book, and the idea of other rooms existing was something that even then resonated with me. So then finding it again in Lana Wachowski was that much more resonant. So those are kind of the two touchstones for this this object, this window that says other rooms. And this is a work that I made with Jarvis Hall, but really, Jarvis is somebody who has such incredible technical skill when it comes to framing and woodworking. But he also is someone who he really knows art history. And he, when I approached him to say, like, can you help me make this? By which I mean, can you please make this for me? Because I have no skills in woodworking. He immediately understood what I meant when I said, well, I want it to look like arts and crafts, but also German expressionist woodblock. And he was like, yeah, I get it. And a few weeks later, I came back and this was the object. And so it's like you say, it is like a screen, like or like a gate, or like something that creates a kind of cloister environment. But it's also something that I think of like an extrusion device, kind of like a pasta machine, or like an extruder that you would use in ceramics. So basically, this object that says other rooms is about, well, it opens up a portal or a conduit between the Gallery 1 and Gallery 2. But also, I think it suggests that those works on paper, the blue and white ones that are the kind of silhouettes, it's as if that research outcome has kind of been pushed through this extruder onto the other side. And what's resulted is these crisp black and white cutouts. And for me, that actually is a bit like the way a methodology works. When I use a methodology to formulate my questions and to drive my research, it is a bit like starting with clay and pushing it through an extruder. You're turning this raw material into something that, like, you are very deliberately shaping into something. There are no accidents with methodology, even if you don't mean to do something. Once you apply a methodology, I think it is a bit like a process of extrusion. So yeah, I'm glad that you asked about portals, because of course that's the title of the show. The title of the show is Portal. And I really do think about every one of the objects that's in the show as being like a gateway or a portal that can be used to enter into another space, whether that's about accessing a historic event that is relatively little understood, I would say, or little known, or whether it's about thinking about oneself in connection to that archive, in connection to that history, one's own sexuality and gender, one's own identity. But then also, the design of this quilt is a kind of, it's not a trapezoid. It's basically like a distorted square. And, that...
A rhombus.
A rhombus. There we go. So that too is like a portal that we can go into. And maybe actually I'll mention that the quilt and the text that's on that quilt is also fashioned as an artist multiple, which is a silkscreen multiple that I made with Jane Trash, who also goes by the name Megan Kirk, or Gaptooth Sweatsuit, who did the printing for me, and that those multiples are available at Latitude or through Latitude, and that $10 from every sale goes to a CC1. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that fundraising initiative too.
Wonderful. I know that questions are coming through the chat, and I want to make sure that we have some time to address them. So I'm looking at my questions. I've asked one of them, like one of the questions I actually had prepared for you. So we're going to be a little bit more democratic with the conversation and open it up to thoughts and queries coming through comments. So I'm going to share one from Bogdan Chita. I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. So the observation and the question is, I'm curious about the way the jackets are presented on observation tables as objects, and if at some point they might become wearable. In becoming wearable, is there a point in their careers as commodities, and he references Aryan Apadari, to becoming vehicles, tools for healing? And also, does the white cube prevent this transformation?
That's a great question. Bogdan, it is so nice to have you in the talk. So Bogdan and I have worked together. Bogdan was a graduate student that I co-supervised at the Alberta University of the Arts. So it's really nice that you could make it today. And yeah, what a great query. I mean, thinking about Appadurai's idea of the social biography of things and, kind of like the moments that commodities go through, or thinking about, commodities not as a stable category, but something that is like a set of circumstances. I think these jackets are actually really relevant to that idea. And I mean, Bogdan and I have had the chance to talk about that introduction to that collection of essays in person. So I'll answer the question, but I'll do my best to not leave out anybody who hasn't read the book or read that introduction. So I mean, those jackets, I mean, right now, are they commodities? I think is a really reasonable question, because they are made to mimic the appearance of commodities, right? Like this commercially produced jacket from 1979 that was left at the scene of a murder. Incidentally, the murder, I forgot to mention, took place underneath a street light that had been specially installed in that alley to try and prevent homosexual activity from taking place. It was something that the city installed. And of course, it ended up being like the spotlight on the murder scene. So thinking about the way that like that jacket is kind of like mise en vedette by that spotlight, but also by this historic event, I think is actually a lot like how commodities largely function, like through advertising, through their circulation in stores. It's all about spotlighting that object, attracting our desire, attracting our willingness to spend money on that commodity. But then, I mean, I guess the other side of it too is if we're thinking about these jackets not in the abstract or in the symbolic, like the reality is that they were handmade, they weren't mass produced, they were made, I would say, like on a quite like intimate collegial kind of level, with Jolie and I interacting with each other and kind of like looking at samples, sending things back and forth. And I mean, Jolie did 100% of the sewing. So I think that's where your question gets even more complex too, because although they were handmade, I did not hand make them. And it was through capital that it was possible for me to ask someone else to make them. So is this just, is this the commodity like on a very, very small scale? I'm not sure that I can fully answer that question about whether they are or are not commodities, but I will say that, I mean, their placement in the gallery certainly makes them into a form of commodity. I mean, I can't pretend that they aren't, because I mean, I'm commercially represented by Pierre-François Ouellette in Montreal. And I mean, I don't want to be crass, but I think that when an artist that is commercially represented shows their work, there's always the luster of commodity about what they show. Even the most resistant practices that seem to deny their commodity status, like something that is performative or something that is ephemeral. Institutions are capitalism is very sneaky and it finds a way to commodify even things that we don't intend to commodify. So I can't say like, oh, well, I don't intend them to function as commodities and think that makes any difference about what they're actually going to do now that they are part of the field of contemporary art, I hope, by being in this show. But I like this question. I think it's actually it's a really slippery question, and I like that kind of question. But I think there was a section of that question that I have not yet answered. Or
it's about the transfer, the gallery. There is the part about the whether or not the white cube space or the gallery prevents the transformation from becoming vehicles. Okay, so from an object commodity to becoming a vehicle tool for healing. Does the white cube space interrupt that transformation in a sense?
Yeah, it does not for me. And I made these for myself, if I can be frank.
Yeah.
I think that it is a complex question that is often asked in grad school and at art school about who your intended audience is, and like, why are you making these things, and all of that stuff. And I do think about those questions, and not everything that I make is for me, but those jackets are absolutely for me. They are surrogates. I made them for myself. I mean, I should rephrase that. I asked Jolie to make them for me because I wanted to have some kind of tactile connection with this history through a surrogate. And, it makes me think a little bit about, Crystal, your earlier question about the archive. Like, when we go seeking in the archive, we're looking for, sometimes it's because we're lonely, we're hurting, we're looking for connection. And I just thought, okay, well, for many reasons right now, physically accessing the archive is not possible in most cases because of the pandemic. But also, it's not really adequate for what I wanted to do, which was to be able to wear the jacket. I wanted to wear the jacket. I wanted to put it on, and I wanted to inhabit that space, inhabit that being. And I think this is where the connection to dramaturgy and being a writer or a playwright comes along. I think is that I wanted to imagine, like, thinking about how I could become a part of this history, how I could seek out a connection to this history. And by wearing the jacket seemed to be a way to do that. And I mean, I guess then the question is, like, did it work? I guess it depends on what I thought the outcome was supposed to be. I mean, I definitely felt a sense of kind of satisfaction when I was able to put it on. And it wasn't just about congratulating myself as an artist. I think it was about, feeling a different form of connection with the history than I had before. And I mean, it's a question that I'm going to continue to think about, because I think the wearability does matter for me, but I don't have an intention of anybody else wearing these jackets. And I think that maybe that's also part of what is behind Bogdan's question about, like, whether I imagine visitors to the gallery also being able to put it on.
Yeah. Well, the objects can have a life without you present too, which, for any of us who've worked in galleries or museums, we know this to be true. These objects have these other lives that we can't always police. And I've heard some really interesting stories over the years from artists about things being touched that were never intended to be touched. And, somebody, I can attest that my child has broken things at galleries before, and I'm quite fortunate to know some artists, so I can call them right away when my child breaks their stuff. And I want so desperately, just in hearing your last bit of a response to Bogdan, to continue along this line where we're talking about simultaneity and concurrence and queer notions of time, but I also know that there's other questions, so that'll be something we talk about another time. So we have another question from Levin Ifko, and it is as follows. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned framing your sculptures as a proposal or as an opportunity. I'm curious to know more about what this means to you.
Thanks, Levin. And so again, so nice to have a familiar person in the audience. I'm so glad that they could make it. So a proposal, framing it as a proposal. Well, I mean, I've done a couple of public artworks, one collaboratively, another one solo. Actually, I guess it depends on how you define, like, a public artwork. I've done things in public space, including a couple of things that are, like, part of official public art programs. And, it's been a complicated process, because when you put something in public space, obviously you have to take account of, safety, and you have to take account of public response and how people are going to react in a way that often you don't have to the same degree when something is inside of a gallery. And so, I mean, when I say that these little photographic reproductions of these Strathmore paper monuments, when I say that they're proposals, I suppose that what I mean is that they're like questions, actually, in the way that if somebody makes a proposal of marriage, for instance, then really it's like you're asking a question, and you're looking for some kind of answer or some kind of response. And I think that my kind of proposed question with this component of the work, the kind of proposal for public artwork component of it, is really about, like, the proposed question is about what value a monument or a counter monument or a memorial would have. What would that do for people of various identities that is not already happening? And that's really the reason why I've chosen to leave them in cardboard and in paper, because there are, I wonder about even the category of the counter monument going forward as being a means by which histories can really adequately be reckoned with. I mean, there are lots of case studies that I think are effective, but are they, I think of like the Monument Against Fascism in Hamburg, Germany, or about Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, like these forms of counter monument they are recessed, they're about making something that's visible invisible, they are about provoking gathering, they're about they are touchstones for communication. And I think that there's a lot of power in that, but I'm not sure that a counter monument to this history, like a physical large-scale sculpture of the Maya Lin or Esther Schall of Goetz and Jochen Goetz variety, is actually what this history beckons from us. Because I think that it is a history that it's so bound up in homophobia and fear and violence that I'm not sure that it really should be something that is situated like in a park or a garden. I mean, the most obvious thing, of course, would be, okay, let's make this thing. Let's make it out of Corten steel. Let's install it at Central Memorial Park, and we'll have a gathering, and Mayor Nenshi will say some words about, visibility and safety and so on and so forth. And, I mean, maybe that does have value. I'm not sure, but that's not the kind of artist that I feel like right now. I mean, maybe 10 years from now, it will feel a little bit different, but I would much rather present something that is actually really humble or humiliated, I guess, coming out of this research process, because the process was so humbling. I think I went into this exhibition and the planning around this exhibition imagining something that was much more grandiose than what it really became, because I think that a central question that often comes up with counter monuments has to do with the identity of the maker and the way that they approach consultation or collaboration with communities that are involved in the histories. And I would much rather propose these fragile cardboard and paper monuments as things that are ephemeral, that they are, I mean, I put them in the fireplace. That is where these paper monuments went. I think I still have one that has not yet been burned, to the horror of my partner, who's like, "What? You should be keeping those for the archive." I guess the proposal is, it's not that I'm saying burn up the history. That's not the intended message of like my little anecdote there, but rather that I think I've realized my own inadequacy about dealing with this history, and that I have taken this history as far as I think is appropriate for me to do. And perhaps there are other people, Levin, Bogdan, other people in the audience who could take histories like this in other directions, in continuum, with their own identities. But I've realized that I've hit my end point. I guess that's kind of my proposal in a way. My proposal is, this is the experiment of the research, and now it's at its end point. It's done.
We currently don't have any other comments in or questions in the comments. But if there's time and Adam will allow us, I wouldn't mind continuing along with along the trajectory of what you were just on, Mark, and thinking about ceremony as a continuation of monument, or perhaps capable of achieving some of the same kind of intentions or goals of monuments. And I had come across recently, I went to see a Diane Arbus exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I don't really think of Arbus as an artist that holds a lot of space in my mind on the daily, but I went to see the show because I understood the work to be of importance and felt like I should kind of make the pilgrimage. And I came across this reproduction of an excerpt from a research proposal that Arbus had written to the Guggenheim Foundation from almost 60 years ago. And I want to share this text here because I think there's something that I see having some sort of resonance with what you're doing too, Mark. And the text is, and I quote, "I want to photograph the considerable ceremonies of our present because we tend, while living here and now, to perceive only what is random and barren and formless about it. While we regret that the present is not like the past and despair of its ever becoming the future, its innumerable, inscrutable habits lie in wait for their meaning. These are our symptoms and our monuments. I want simply to save them, for what is ceremonious and curious and commonplace will be legendary." And, I don't want to confuse notions of ceremony in this context with notions of ethnocultural ceremonies. I'm kind of thinking of more, and I imagine that Arbus is thinking more of the kind of vernacular forms of ceremony. And I think about vernacular forms of monuments often because, we think monuments tend to suggest something of grand scale, of like extravagant budgets, and of collective purpose. But there are forms of monuments, maybe ceremonies kind of fit here, where the goal is not to address the collective. That, in fact, the desire is really to disavow the collective, and it's much more about a kind of individual experience. So I wonder if you might be able to reflect on vernacular forms of monument that can, if you've experienced any other ones, if they are capable of still doing the kind of things that kind of run-of-the-mill monuments do over time. Like, is there a conceivable or perceivable future wherein the vernacular ends up being the same as the collective monument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe in the power of vernacular monuments. Absolutely. I mean, again, growing up in Alberta, going up and down the highway that connects Edmonton and Calgary, growing up, there are so many examples of what I think we could frame as vernacular monuments. A lot of them are various forms of signage and billboard that are, put on the side of a semi-truck that's just parked on the side of the highway, or painted onto the side of a barn or a silo, or, any number of other architectural features. And you really get the sense of the political climate of the place according to those forms of vernacular monument of any place, not just Alberta. And over, so I think that let's see, as an adult, I've probably lived in the province for a total of about 10 years now. I lived here from, birth until the age of 19. Wait, that's not right. Birth until the age of 24-ish. And yeah, I mean, over time, like these forms of vernacular monument, they have shifted in their temperature, their tenor, and their topic. And I think they're a really amazing litmus of a political moment. But of course, they also have political effect too. They're not just a record; they're also an actor. They have a degree of agency because they're so visible, So I mean, there's this one silo that says something like "Revenge of the Nerds." I'm sure some people have seen that. It's like so visible, you cannot avoid it. And then there are other much more upsetting forms of vernacular monument that I mean are just so grotesque that I'm not even gonna describe them in this meeting. But people that live in this province, they know about the kinds of billboards and vernacular signage that I'm talking about that has existed, for at least the last 40 years on that road, and probably even before that. So, I think that the vernacular monument is extremely powerful. It can have a lot of benefit, but it can also have a lot of deleterious effect too. I mean, just because it's a monument and it's vernacular doesn't mean that it's necessarily a positive thing. I think that a lot of destructive attitudes and hateful attitudes can come out of these forms of improvised vernacular signage, which, I mean, I know that I'm going a little bit of an extra step here to like automatically tie together public signage with vernacular monument or vernacular memorial. But if a monument or a memorial is about communicating values associated with a history, then I think these billboards and silos and barns and so on are absolutely doing that. But then it makes me think about another form of vernacular monument that's kind of, it's part of my decision to become an artist that I just really, really quickly want to talk about, because it also has to do, I guess, with ceremony in a really direct, like jokey, punny kind of way, but then another form of ceremony too. So the story is that growing up, every year, my parents on their anniversary took my sister and I for breakfast. I mean, it just seems like the weirdest thing now. But at the time I was like, yeah, it's your anniversary. We're all going for breakfast. And I mean, we hardly ever ate out, but this one day a year, we always did. And it was always on the weekend, no matter what day of the week their anniversary landed on. And as we got older, we kind of stopped going to the Smitty's and we started going to a place called the Chateau Lacombe, which is not nearly as fancy as it sounds. It's a rotating restaurant that still exists. It's near the river, again, not so far from Latitude. And this one year, I mean, I think I was probably 14 years old. And we're in this revolving restaurant. And I mean, it's an incredible view. You just see the land is so beautiful from up there. But you also, of course, see the encroachment of urbanization and some of the like really horrible things of the city. And there's this one section that you rotate over that is, it's either a baseball diamond or a series of baseball diamonds. It's kind of blended up in my memory right now. And as we were kind of like rotating, I mean, you're going at about this speed, right? What comes into view is that it's January, somebody has walked through the snow to make a message in the snow. And it's only as the restaurant is rotating that it becomes possible to see it. And the message is, will you marry me? Nothing, get married if you want to. It's that I don't make the face because of that. The reason I make the face is because every couple that was in that rotating restaurant was basically taken hostage by that well-meaning person who inscribed this message in the snow with their footprints. And I just thought it was the most hilarious thing, but also that there really was something very beautiful about it too, as someone wanting to express something publicly and maybe doing it in a way that didn't quite go the way that they might have imagined. I mean, maybe the answer was no, or maybe there were couples who, didn't really expect to see that message. I think it probably led to a lot of confusion on that day. And I liked that. I like that feeling. I mean, when I say that it's one of the reasons I became an artist, it's because I liked that feeling of ambiguity and sort of being unexpectedly taken on this journey by this bit of text that we came across. So I guess that that's one way of thinking about ceremony here, is that, of course, like the punny side of it is like a marriage ceremony, but that's not the way I was thinking about it. It's more about the ceremony of a kind of unveiling. So when this message, "Will you marry me?" was revealed by us rotating around the restaurant, it was a bit like a curtain kind of coming up. And there was something that was so ceremonious about it that it gave it this luster of this kind of gleam of importance. And it made it into something like, it was something that was so simple, but also just had a lot of beauty, which I think is kind of like the everyday form of ceremony that you were referring to in your question, Crystal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I apologize for disappearing and coming back. My computer actually just shut down while you were speaking, Mark.
Dear.
So
No problem.
It's been a day of that. But I'm also looking at the time, and I realize that we have gone like way over what we understood to be the kind of limits of our conversation. And yet I feel like we could be chatting for a long time. And I hope that folks who may have introduced questions to the chat in the last few minutes don't feel like they've been kind of shortchanged by the conversation today. And I would encourage them to find ways to connect with Latitude 53, the team there, in order to kind of think further about your exhibition. And I guess on behalf of everyone who's here and watching and listening for the afternoon, thank you so much, Mark, for your generosity and the clarity of your vision, and for making this work that's so worthy of our reflection and our thoughts. So thank you so much, and thanks to Adam for manning the back end of the
Adam.
Conversation. You're a wizard, and yeah, I don't know, Adam, do you have any closing words for Latitude 53?
Not too much to say. I do want to thank both of you so much for sharing this. It has gone long, but it's been really great. It's wonderful to hear all of this, especially in this time when it's so hard for us to like be in space together and look at work together. And anyway, it's really means a lot to all of us to be able to have you here and share all of this. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam. And thank you so much, Crystal, for being in dialogue with me. And I do want to mention, by the way, that Crystal wrote an amazing exhibition text for the show that is just so evocative and beautiful and brings like layers of interpretive meaning and also like beautiful, suggestive ambiguity to the show that I'm just so satisfied with and so grateful for, including a reference to Lana Wachowski's speech and also to a text that asks the question, "Is the rectum a grave?" Which is actually just what the last thing I want to say is that when I first talked to Crystal about writing about this show, I said, "So Crystal, I'm doing a show. It's called Portal, but it's actually about the rectum."
And I was like, I'm down with that.
That was my lead. And also I am on Instagram. So if anybody wants to ask about why this show is about the rectum, it has to do with this essay that asks that question.
Yeah,
I'm happy to answer questions over Instagram.
It's such I'm glad that you mentioned Leo Bersani's text, because it is, I mean, it's an earlier text, I think, or definitely earlier than, say, the Wachowski script, but there's so much in there that, when I think about what it would have been like for folks to discover their sexuality in, say, the 90s, there's so much insight and intelligence that underlines those thoughts, that I would encourage everyone to read it and then find the quote that we snuck into the text.
Yeah, and you can highlight every sentence, every word.
Everyone.
I would invite folks to, although, as I said at the beginning, the gallery is closed. Today is, in fact, the last day that we're allowed to have people in the space for the time being. If you visit us at latitude53.org, you can see more images of the work, and Crystal's text is also posted there. And yeah, we can dream that maybe we'll be able to see some more folks in person in the new year before we take the work down. We'll see.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
to all of our audience.